Starting a med spa feels like a fresh start. Low insurance, no insurance billing, and big demand. But under the surface, it's legally risky. I've seen clinics lose everything because they didn't know who could own what, supervise who, or even do an IV. In this episode, I'll walk you through the legal landmines and aesthetics and how to keep your cash business from crashing. Stay to the end, and I'll give you a launch checklist to use before you sign your lease. All right, so a medical spa called our law firm, and they had just opened in a luxury building. They were offering Botox and IVs, and they got a cease and desist in 3 months. The reason they got a cease and desist, as we later found out, was that there was a jealous competitor that had actually complained about them to the board and was poking holes in their whole legal setup. And this is not uncommon in the medical spa industry. It is very competitive. There's plenty of money out there. Usually there's cash pay, and that can really make it feel like medical spas are less regulated. But in fact, they aren't. I'm going to talk about some of the ways that you may receive a board complaint and how to fight back against that. So I think there's really 2, maybe 3 main sources of how a board complaint or legal action starts. So one of them we already talked about. That was staff, okay? Right? So it's a staff. We didn't classify them correctly. They go to the Department of Labor. But you know how they say that lawyers probably make really bad legal clients? I think medical professionals also make for bad patients. And what I mean by that is another source of medical board complaints is actually the patients themselves. So if that happens to be another nurse, another medical doctor, someone who may be in a related industry and has your whole operation under a microscope, if things don't go well for them, or maybe they're just jealous of the setup, they're just unsatisfied with their services, there's some tension there, boom, they're sending out a board complaint to the nursing board or the medical board. Not fun. The last one, as I mentioned at the beginning, is going to be the jealous competitor. You know, it's generally a jealous competitor. And so they've gone through, just as you have, all of this time and money and energy setting up their medical spa. And for better or for worse, you're in the same area. So you're slightly competitive to each other doing Botox and IV in this scenario. And unfortunately, with this client, they were blowing up. They had Google reviews, their website was going, their socials were really strong, and they were getting on the radar of the community. And I think some of the patients of the other medical spa were coming over. That obviously made the medical spa upset. Lo and behold, that owner was Googling and searching around, found them, and realized, okay, there's no way that they're doing everything right. You know, this was really hard for me to set up. Boom, they're just firing off board complaints. Unfortunately, a medical board or a nursing board, depending on the state, usually has a duty to investigate to protect the public, even if that complaint is completely fabricated. In this case, it was a gray area, but it's enough where we don't want to get on their radar. So those are really the top 3 ways that for a medical spa, you might be triggering some of that scrutiny. The good news is that if you do everything that I talk about in some of the episodes here of the David Holt Show, we're going to lay that nice legal foundation. We're going to be ready to go and move forward with confidence. It really doesn't matter what the competition is, whether you're serving medical doctors as patients, you're going to be ready to go. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning too, just because you're a medical spa doesn't mean that you should think that you're less regulated than others. There's a common misconception and a false assumption that since I'm a medical spa and I'm just taking cash, I'm taking payments straight from the patients, that I don't need to deal with insurance, that I don't need to deal with Medicare, Medicaid, and all those rules. Yes, that may be true, but still there's other rules, you know, just good old-fashioned medical record keeping. Labor law still applies, fee splitting law still apply, all of the physician kickback rules still apply. And so you need to be smart and make sure that, yes, okay, we're not billing insurance. That's nice. We're not billing Medicaid. We're not billing Medicare. But we still need to have the proper policies and legal documents in place so that, like in this scenario, if somebody files that complaint, the jealous competitor or 2, we got all of our legal ducks in a row. So let's talk about where things actually go wrong so you don't make the same mistakes. If you're even thinking about opening a medical spa, hit like and subscribe. This could save your business before it even starts. Now, in one state, registered nurses can inject. In another, they can't touch a syringe without supervision. Most founders don't even know the difference. And that's where they get into trouble. They're running on to, Facebook and Reddit and seeing and trying to decide, okay, well, what can I do? What can my RN do? And then they run with that advice, and what may work in Florida or New York or Texas may not work in Minnesota or California. So you need to be very smart about which state you're in, especially if we're getting into a telehealth situation, because the state rules are going to be different. Unfortunately, we do not have a federal medical spa law, so it becomes very state specific. And on top of that, for each procedure, there's often not a Botox or IV procedure. So let's start with who can do what. So an RN, registered nurse, generally needs to be under supervision. It's going to vary based on state. But RNs are usually the workhorses of the medical world. When you go into a hospital, a clinic, they are generally the ones that you see the most, providing more of the routine care, but a lot of boots on the ground type care is what I say. They're doing a lot of the procedures, but generally under supervision. And they're generally under supervision by a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, or a medical doctor. What's interesting is that there's been a wave of states that have started to allow nurse practitioners to do more and almost operate independently. It's highly state specific. It's very controversial in some states. MDs, medical doctors, being generally the most highest level healthcare professional and can generally do most things. Then we work our way down into physician's assistants, which are right underneath them. So with proper supervision, can also generally do most things. Nurse practitioners are kind of in between, and it's all going to depend on what the state practice act for that nurse allows. So you got to be very careful with who's doing what procedure. Usually when I get involved as the healthcare attorney, I actually start with the procedures that we're doing, and then I work my way back into who can do them and whether supervision is required or not. To further complicate things, there's a whole nother set of licensed and sometimes unlicensed people that are estheticians. Now, not every state has their own separate esthetician licensing, and that can make things a little bit confusing. It means that we could be dealing with medical services and maybe some quasi non-medical services. So there's a lot of gray areas there. And we need to be very smart, because if you're using the word medical for medical spa, you can't just loosely use that term. Otherwise, the medical board might be upset with you. And so whenever we're using the term medical, my general assumption, if I'm being conservative, and we're not going to go through every single state, is that there's probably a medical doctor involved and or an independently licensed practitioner, meaning a nurse practitioner in a state that is allowed to operate independently without any supervision. And then, even then, we're being very careful about our use of the word medical. So it gets highly nuanced, which is why it's important to look at the rules and work your way back. Now, your malpractice and state board are actually going to care about, and that is, does what you have documented actually align with the law? And it doesn't actually matter if you tried to provide good patient care. They're going to look at the procedure that was done on the specific patient and who was involved, which maybe it was a registered nurse that did the procedure, but they had proper supervision that we talked about in the previous episode with a medical doctor. So all of the dots are linked and we're good to go. I just put a lot out there. And the main takeaway is this. There are a lot of moving parts, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. However, this is a standard set of steps you can take to help simplify all this. Here's the thing. Most med spas take hundreds of thousands of dollars in R&D and years of trial and error just to figure out how to launch and actually make it work. But the good news? I've already done the hard work for you. I put together the ultimate med spa launch checklist so you don't have to waste that time or money. If you want it, just hit the link in the description. The checklist walks you through everything: ownership, licensing, procedure list, supervision plan, and even cash compliance. It's all in there. Let me just share a little bit of it with you now. The clinics that thrive in aesthetics do three things: they follow scope laws, they document protocols, and they structure their ownership right. Let's first talk about ownership. Ownership in healthcare is a little more complicated. There's a tricky thing called the corporate practice of medicine doctrine, which means that not everyone can actually own a medical spa, and we need to be very careful about that. In most states, only a licensed medical professional, usually a medical doctor, needs to be involved when we're talking about a medical spa. But that's not all states. In fact, when you're doing a multi-state expansion, the laws in each state can be very different. So we at least want to check and usually default to the most conservative states' rules. But there are a lot of cool things that you can do with ownership in the states that are a little more lax. Also, before starting, besides liking and subscribing to the David Holt Show, which talk about all of the other, setup, the labor law, and all the other things that you should do before you start, I want you to think about the ownership and the structure itself, because those two big decisions are pretty hard to reverse later and are also the source of a lot of headaches when we go to exit, like I talked about in a previous episode, or when we're trying to add other owners later, or trying to think of other terms of revenue. Good news is this is all going to be in the checklist itself. Obviously, I would prefer that you engage an attorney, but I think the checklist can get you most of the way there, especially if you're trying to do some of this on your own. This wraps up our series, but if you missed earlier episodes, go back and catch the one on hiring 1099s, because that's where most of these problems begin. If you're serious about building a legal, scalable healthcare business, don't stop here. Go back and watch the other episodes in this series. They stack together to give you the full roadmap.